Welcome to the Sci-Fi Evolution channel. The twilight that enveloped Elvira's life was colored in the crimson tones of history written on the sands of gladiatorial arenas. In the glow of the two suns that illuminated the spiral towers of the citadel, Queen Zyra sat on an obsidian throne, dressed in royal purple and filled with contempt. Her voice carried through the halls of the royal court, where nobles and warlords gathered to judge her legacy and her flesh by the light of the ceremonial fire. "May the galaxy be a witness," she proclaimed, pointing to the wounded man, who was crouching under the weight of his name. "If this Terran survives the ordeal of the monsters, I will give away the most precious jewel of my kind, my daughter." Whispers swept through the courtyard, and even the courtiers, who lived by scandals, fell silent to realize the gravity of the situation. The queen's daughter, Princess Ruthi, dressed in white and decorated with ceremonial gold, lifted her chin but said nothing. Her eyes showed no surprise, only rage that had been tempered by centuries of royal discipline. Ruthi had spent her life in seclusion, but now her mother had put her on display. She was sold not for her alliance, but for her arrogance. In the chambers, a gladiator stood in front of them, his body covered with scars and one arm in a sling. He was holding a jagged blade that had once belonged to a Terran general. His name was Corin Mar. He was a former field medic who became a soldier after surviving wars not by chance, but by his own choice. Now he faced the impossible, not for the sake of fame, but because he had nothing to lose. The herald announced the terms, and the sound of ceremonial horns reverberated from the balconies of the tower. "The fight will take place at dawn at the Colosseum, an ancient and unfiltered arena. The queen chose her deliberately. It will be violent and will take place live, without cameras or political interference." Ruthi looked at the Terran, and their eyes met. There was no pleading in his gaze. Corin stood on the rough granite floor, his feet bare. The stale air caressed his skin, like the breath of every Terran ghost behind him. He felt their presence, not as voices, but as a weight. The soldiers he couldn't save, the screams of the wounded on the battlefield, the mistakes that haunted him. But he was standing there, facing the gate, which opened with a loud rattle of metal chains. The queen's creature roared. A biogenetic hybrid of predator and disease, bred for war, he craved blood. He towered over Corin, his eyes like polished glass, and his tentacles were stitched with plasma coils. His growl echoed through the walls and penetrated Corin's bones, and the onlookers above leaned forward, eager to see the man being torn in two. But Corin remained motionless. Instead, he studied the creature intently, not with fear, but from the perspective of a man who studied anatomy in the field by torchlight. He observed the joints, the rhythms of his breathing, and the exposed spinal coils where the armor had failed. He knew that he would win not by force, but by understanding. The beast charged, and Corin dodged its sweeping claw, feeling a burning sensation as it tore open the stitches on his side. Rolling through the blood-stained dust, he abruptly raised the blade, not to kill, but to throw it off balance, crashing into the joint behind his forelimb. The creature screamed and recoiled, and Corin lunged at its back, plunging the broken blade into its vulnerable spot. A bone fragment pierced through the plasma repeater, causing sparks and confusion. Despite this, the creature roared, knocking the warrior across the arena. However, the warrior stood up again. His face was covered in blood, his knees were shaking, his breathing was ragged, but his purpose remained unwavering. In the viewing gallery, Queen Zyra's grin turned into something less confident. Ruthi stood motionless, no longer shackled, but without moving. She watched as the Terran fought not to survive, but to finish. The crowd moved, their laughter turning into something they hadn't felt in decades. It was curiosity. Immersed in his own pain, Corin made his last move. He rushed straight at the beast, slipping under its body, and with all his remaining strength plunged the blade upward into its open heart duct. The creature convulsed and collapsed. There was silence again, a palpable silence, heavy as mourning. Corinne knelt in the dust, his shoulders slumped, his body in ruins. He won. Not as a champion, not as a hero, but a queen who refused to be erased. In that silence, something irreversible was set in motion. The queen, her face now pale, slowly rose to her feet, her hands shaking from the weight of her gambling. The people of Sarthi will remember this day, not for the blood that was shed, but for the chain that broke when the Terran did not die. The echo of Corinne's final blow still hung in the dry air of the arena. However, Queen Zyra did not move. She lived a life of confidence, protected by tradition and crowned with the arrogance of generations. For her bets were not risks, they were instruments of humiliation. The daughter was nothing more than a symbol, a glittering spectacle that she used to embellish her political games. But now she had found her own rhythm, standing silently next to the human victor. Her eyes were not of defeat, but of reckoning. Zyra gripped the arms of her throne with trembling fingers as a chance. Corinne, his body covered in blood and his spine bent, stood in front of the royal box. The old pain in his hip throbbed, but he refused to let it distract him. His gaze was fixed on the queen, and he looked up with a calmness that surprised the audience. He was there not to celebrate, but to state the truth. There was no joy, no satisfaction, only the truth that nothing could change what had happened. An ordinary man acting on instinct and determination destroyed the queen's confidence. Corinne knew that this battle was not about glory, but about value. Zyra, the queen, slowly rose from her throne, her regal bearing wavering. Her expression was unreadable as she made a sign to the herald. He stumbled forward, holding a parchment in his hand, his voice trembling as he read out the sacred law written in blood. The terms were sealed with breath. Blood. If the intruder manages to overcome the dangers of the creatures, the princess will be granted, restricted, and given power. A collective sigh reverberates throughout the audience. The nobles, envoys, and high-ranking military leaders who had come to witness the Terran's humiliation were now whispering like snakes under a fallen roof. Ruti turned to her mother, and for the first time in her life, the queen looked away. Corinne was brought to the queen's chambers, not as a prisoner or a prize, but as a force that destroyed the old order. He was accompanied by 2 guards. Their silence and concern were obvious. They did not dare to touch him. His breathing was labored, his armor in tatters, but his eyes were burning with a quiet fire. Zyra descended from the throne, each step carried with pride. Her daughter now stood between them, not as a pawn or royalty, but as a judge. Rathia's gaze moved between them like an outstretched sword. "Meet the conditions," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The queen swallowed her shame. "The Terran can take her if he dares." Corinne didn't say a word. The remains of the chains fell to the ground with a sound that reverberated through centuries of tradition. It wasn't the chains themselves, but what they symbolized. It was an ancient belief that daughters were just property, the legacy of a bet, a pride that was more valuable than a soul. Ruti took a deep breath, freed from the confines of court etiquette, and moved away from her mother. Every step felt like a revolution in her bones. She didn't look back, didn't ask for permission. Corinne watched her approach with the weary patience of a man who has fought too long to romanticize victory. He didn't reach out to her, didn't smile. Instead, he bowed his head in a subtle, respectful gesture, like a soldier saluting an equal. Ruti stopped in front of him, her eyes sharp with questions, her posture tense with a mixture of defiance and curiosity. "What are you going to do with me? What is it?" she asked. Ruti was neither scared nor submissive. It was a calculation. The ship's engines roared to life. Corinne replied with a mixture of intelligence and bitterness. "I'm not a trophy collector, no matter what you decide to do with yourself. This unplanned moment, which was not captured by political machinations, attracted the attention of every observer. A whisper rose, then died away. The queen, still standing on the edge of her throne, watched her daughter walk away, not to obedience, but to something unknown and potentially dangerous. Ruti bent down, took the Terran's bloody hand, and said, "Let's get out of here before they catch us in their ceremonies." Together, they turned their backs on dice, guards, velvet, and the weight of the Roscari tradition. People weren't shocked by the violence, but by the rejection. When they walked out of the Great Hall, the silence they left behind was louder than any battle cry. Corinne's ship was waiting for them outside, a battered Terran gunboat, held together by luck and repairs. Ruti boarded without hesitation. Inside, she touched the control panel, and the engines roared to life. Like an alien text, Ruti turned to him. "Tell me," she asked, "does your world force women to fight through inheritance?" Corin smiled, his lips bruised. "No," he replied. "They fight because they want to, and they often come out victorious." Ruti sat next to him, her pulse steady, her eyes bright. "Okay," she said. "Then teach me." The stars outside the porthole twinkled like broken glass frozen in the middle of an explosion. But Ruti wasn't looking at them. She bent over the Terran ration, dissecting its contents with the precision of a trained assassin. Corin watched from the co-pilot's seat, his arm freshly bandaged and his ribs wrapped in pressure foam. His breathing was still labored after the fight. He had not yet fully realized the depth of this young woman under her royal title. But her every move told him that she was not looking for salvation. She was looking for a battle. Not one that was fought with claws or stakes, but one that tore out old wounds of the soul. She said, finally unwrapping the protein briquette as if it might explode. "Never," she added. Corinne offered no consolation. He didn't believe in disguising pain with pleasantries. "You won't break," he said. "But you have to learn to navigate the world without a crown on your head or guards on your back. It means sweat, bruises, and silence." The following days were harsh, not because of the problems the galaxy presented, but because they had to unlearn. Corinne trained Ruti the way he trained Terran medics to survive in the jungle, where the trees emit acid and the wind howls with madness. She learned to track movements by observing shadows, heal wounds with improvised materials, discern intent by one breath, and stifle her screams when she slipped down a steep slope while climbing, bleeding from her palms, bruising her knees, and biting her lip. But she got up again every time, and Corinne, although he never said it out loud, began to see a spark in her that reminded him of the best days he had ever known. Those who weren't born a fighter, but became one when life left them no other choice. One night, near the rusty wreckage of a silent satellite on a forgotten moon, they sat watching a purple storm roll over the horizon. Ruti asked, "Do you think I'm going to break down?" Corinne shook his head. "No, I was just wondering what kind of war you would start when you realized that no one could control you anymore." She had smiled then, not the smile of royalty, but the crooked grin of someone who had lost everything and still had the guts to want more. She didn't sleep in the spare bed that night. She climbed onto the balcony and looked up at the stars, whispering something in her native language, not to her mother, but to the universe. The announcement came the next morning, clear and cold, the Queen's voice reverberating to every corner. A known frequency, similar to thunder dressed in perfume. "This is Queen Zyra of Sarthi, by decree of the Council of Nine and all allies bound by the Flame Pact. I declare the human fugitive Corinne Mach to have violated royal law, and to be guilty of abducting my daughter. A reward will be offered for his capture, dead or alive. To those who are harboring him, know that you are harboring treason." Ruti listened in silence, her hands resting on the controls, motionless. When it was over, she turned off the broadcast with one gesture and said, "So she's afraid." "Okay." Corinne didn't blink. He had expected this. Queens don't lose daughters, they lose tools, and the tools must be returned or destroyed. We won't be able to land in any mapped star system for a while, he said, already adjusting the ship's trajectory to zip through uncharted space. I'm not going to hide, Ruthi replied. Then don't, he said, but we'll move wisely. They will come not only for me, but also for you. You were her bet, and now you're her mistake. The pursuers arrived in waves, some stealthy and cunning, others loud and frantic. The first ship tried to disable their engines during the jump, but Ruthi had previously reconfigured the capacitor grid, causing a false overload that fried their attackers. The second group caught up with them at the mining station, where Ruthi, disguised as a trader, lured two mercenaries into an old decontamination mine and sealed it behind them. Corinne didn't draw his weapon that time. Instead, he just watched, and for the first time, he noticed that Ruthi was no longer looking for his guidance. Now she was choosing her own weapon. Their relationship was not romantic. She was deeper than that, Ruthi. It was a mutual understanding between two beings who had been cast aside, but now rose from the ashes, fueled by perseverance and defiance. At an abandoned station orbiting a red dwarf, Corinne handed Ruthi a Terran token. She asked, "Why?" He replied, "Because one day someone will ask who you are, and I want you to remember that you weren't given to me. You've earned your place by my side." She held the token like a relic, her expression unreadable. "Then it's time for us to stop running," she said. "Let's make the Queen regret every breath she took in that bet." With that, they set a course back to Sarthi territory, not to return, but to rewrite the meaning of the deal that made them both legendary. Sarthi shimmered like a poisonous jewel against the backdrop of dark, untouched cities, with their jeweled towers and citadels decorated with golden splendor. It was a world designed to awe, intimidate, and crush dissent under the weight of etiquette and artificially created luxury. Corinne had seen this before, during the conflicts of the Border Flame Rebellion, but this time he approached it with the intensity of a storm. Ruthi stood next to him in the cockpit, no longer in silk robes or ceremonial jewelry. Instead, she was wearing a black field uniform stained with coal dust and her own blood. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes were sharp, and her silence was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence before the ignition. They did not land in the royal port, but in the lower trading districts, under the cloud bridges, among the forgotten and unrecognized. The whispers followed them as Ruthi walked through the alleys of her childhood, where she had once been paraded like an immaculate piece of jewelry. Later, she was dismissed as a piece of broken glass. Now she was back, not carried or escorted, but walking, her boots echoing in the corridors that knew only the sound of polished slippers. People stared at her intently, some recognized her, some did not, but everyone felt it. Something dangerous and sacred was moving through their city, and it wouldn't bend. Corinne said little as they climbed through the service elevators and back corridors, passing through royal security checkpoints and scanners with coded files stolen from black market archivists. The plan was not to negotiate. He was about to arrive. Arrival, as Ruthi now understood, was a declaration of authority. At the gate of the royal spire, she approached the royal guards without hesitation. They raised their weapons. Corinne didn't flinch. Ruthi didn't ask to enter. She ordered it, and her voice, once trained to sing for the nobility, cracked with the truth as she said, "Tell her that the bet has returned home, and it's time for her to pay." The Queen was waiting for them in her private courtyard, surrounded by virtual advisors and double guards armed with ceremonially engraved rifles. Zaira has aged since she was in the arena. The wrinkles on her face deepened, and the intensity in her gaze decreased. She slowly rose from her throne, clad in layers of emerald silk, her posture still regal, but her breathing was shallow. "Daughter," she said, "you were supposed to be a lesson, not a storm. Ruthi smiled without warmth. Then consider me an additional student. Corin remained silent. He just put the token Ruthi was wearing on the steps of the throne. The gesture was older than the palace, older than Terran history. He conveyed two messages in his culture. I won't belong, and I'm not afraid of you. Zahra's eyes twitched at the gesture, but her lips curled in practiced indifference. You're back, she said. So the bet is still valid. No, Ruthi replied. I came back to finish the game. The council chamber, not intended for bloodshed, was filled with assent as the high-ranking nobility gathered. Ruthi stood in the center of the amphitheater, wrapped in a blanket of silence. She was no longer a mere figure in the game of royalty, but a woman with a voice. She was sold by her own mother, but she wasn't going to be a mere commodity. You sold me with a smile, she said, her voice firm and clear. But I wasn't yours to sell. The queen, surrounded by her guards, stood over them all. The right of blood hung in the air, a right that had not been invoked for more than 4 generations. Ruthi stepped forward, ready to fight for her freedom. With a look that was still determined, the queen descended the steps, shedding her silk with each step. She stood in front of Ruthi, ready to take her by force. But Ruthi wasn't afraid. She knew she had the strength to fight for what she believed in. She will no longer be a simple figure. She will be the queen. Ruthia's armor remained underneath. She hadn't fought since she was young, but the fire in her eyes still burned brightly. Corinne moved to intervene, but Ruthi raised her hand, saying, Let her be. 2 women stood face to face, mother and daughter, tyrant and rebel, one born from protocol, the other from fire. There were no weapons, just fists and memories. The duel was brutal and unvarnished, a clash of bones, breath, and broken history. Ruthi was hit in the temple. Her vision turned red, but she stood up and hit back with renewed vigor, fiercer than ever before. Her mother stumbled, then fell. As Ruthi straddles her mother, ready to deliver the final blow, she hesitates. I don't have to kill you to win, she said, but you had to put your daughter on the line to feel strong. That's the difference. She stood up, leaving her mother gasping on the floor of her own palace. Corin stepped forward and said, The galaxy will remember this day. Ruthi turned to the ward and announced, I claim my right to rule. I only demand my freedom, she said. And anyone else who has ever been sold, silenced, or discarded is no longer alone. Then she walked out, hand in hand with the man who had never owned her but had always seen her. Behind them, the council's silence was shattered, not by a protest, but by hesitant applause. It was not for the royal power, but for the rebellion, for the one who returned, not to regain his crown, but to melt it. The news spread across the interstellar network faster than any official response could contain it. Princess Sarthi has returned, not as a prisoner, but as a rival. Whispers of the revolution spread to distant star systems. The former slaves sent encrypted messages of joy. The forgotten colonies dared to sing her name. The image of Ruthi appeared on 1,000 independent channels, not in the glamour of a polished queen, but in sweat-soaked armor, with bruised knuckles and eyes that burned with well-deserved dignity. She overthrew the queen not by sword or decree, but by her own strength and determination. She did something even more significant. She made her mother look insignificant in front of a world that once accepted her without question. Corinne didn't say anything on the way back through Sarthi territory. Ruthi sat next to him in silence, a different kind of silence than the one she'd worn during their training sessions in the desert. This silence was heavy. It was the silence of a soul rewriting itself. She no longer flinched when her reflection met her eyes. She no longer checked her posture or filtered her words. Now she existed to live up to her own expectations, to accept the fullness of her existence, and finally to learn what it means to live. You didn't kill her. Corinne finally said as their ship glided under the glare of the twin stars. She killed herself the day she believed she could bet on love. Ruthi answered without looking at him. I just provided her with a mirror. Corin nodded once. He had seen soldiers rebuild themselves from the ashes, but he had never witnessed someone discarding their entire bloodline and rising above it. Ruthi not only survived, she surpassed it. The Queen's strategy. She turned it into a cautionary tale. That night, they docked in the orbit of an unnamed moon. Moons with no name, no industry, no history, just damp soil and calm skies. Corinne was standing outside the ship, repairing a stabilizer blade that had been damaged during a skirmish with a bounty hunter. Ruthi came over, carrying a data tablet, which she placed next to him. The tablet glowed with council-level encryption. We have a suggestion for you, she said. The title of ambassador to silence the noise. Corinne did not look up. Are you taking it? She knelt down next to him and ran her fingers over the broken metal. No, she said. I've had enough titles that feel like cages. I'm building something else. Months passed, and Sarthi's throne remained unoccupied, untouched. Not because there was no one to occupy it, but because no one dared to sit where his daughter once left power and taught the stars a new language. Ruthi and Corinne never declared a revolution. They just became her. It has helped someone else achieve more than anyone ever imagined. Ruthi never called him her savior. She called him her anchor, her stillness, her truth when the world tried to silence her. One evening, while repairing the solar panels on a dilapidated temple overgrown with forest vines, Ruthi turned to him and said, "You know, she's still watching. My mother," she said. "I bet she sees my every move and wishes she had made the right decision." Corinne completed the chain and looked at the sunset-lit horizon. "Then," he said, "you owe her a debt of gratitude, not for what she gave, but for what she didn't destroy." They stood together on the edge of this wild world, without crowns, subjects, or flags, just scars, memories, and the sound of the wind carrying songs in a dozen foreign languages. Songs that talked about a girl who once risked her freedom, who became a symbol that no empire could suppress. Not royalty, not property, but a name that is pronounced with reverence from one side of the globe to the other. Ruthi, the one who achieved her status not by ascending to the throne, but by refusing to bow down.